And so I will introduce this person whose work I admire. This is Mari Walker. Mari is an award-winning director, writer, and editor. Films she has worked on have screened at over 300 film festivals, including Sundance, South by Southwest, Frameline, and Outfest. Her work explores identity through multiple forms and genres, championing the shared humanity of others through stories that promote empathy and equality. Mari's film, The Soul of a Tree, won Best Short Documentary at the Cannes Film Festival in 2016. Swim, her first narrative short, won an audience award at the 2017 Los Angeles Film Festival. Her first feature, See You Then, had its world premiere at South by Southwest. Now just finished its theatrical release, which started at the beginning of the month. It has won 7 awards, including Best Narrative Feature at the Sun Valley Film Festival, and is currently rated 96% on Rotten Tomatoes. So welcome to Mari.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start with a trailer for See You Then, and then we'll go into our conversation. Is there a way to not have the lights not be on the screen? I don't know if people will be able to see it if there's a light flashing on the screen.
Yeah.
Well, then we'll just go for it.
Let's go.
Chris? Is that you? Hey. Wow, you look a little different.
Thank you for agreeing to meet up. I know it's probably a little weird after such a long time.
This is the first adult conversation I've been having in months. We were together for 3 years. I had no idea what was going on or why you left.
There were times when I looked at you and I felt like if we stayed together, that maybe that would be enough. The need to transition was like this awful noise, this endless ringing in my head.
It's your testament to how much people can change.
Sometimes I get so used to being me, it doesn't feel that way.
I haven't seen you since you left without any explanation. You left me like I was a stranger, not like somebody that you said that you loved.
This isn't what I wanted, was survival. I hadn't allowed myself to accept who I was.
Did you know when we were together?
I would never have made it this far without friends like you.
We were never friends. Stop pretending that we didn't have a relationship.
I wouldn't be alive today if I hadn't transitioned.
You can't rewrite history, Chris, okay?
You're just trying to hurt me one last time.
You should tell me what was going on.
All right. So, yes.
Thank you, guys.
Pause. So I'm just going to bring up the slideshow, but while I'm doing that, do you want to start with the background on this film?
Yeah,
this is your
sure.
first feature film?
This is the first feature. I have always wanted to make a feature. It has been a lifelong obsession. And of course, I started writing features when I was in college that were way too expensive. And then every year subsequently, I kept on writing smaller and smaller scripts. I was like, this one maybe might work, or this one maybe might work. And we finally got to the place where I was like, oh, it'd be really great to spend time doing an intimate character study, because I'd done a lot of editing and directing documentaries in the past, and I hadn't had a lot of experience directing actors. And so we got the script finished, and then we started reaching out to various production companies, but unfortunately, almost all of them uniformly passed. We had Vanishing Angle, our main production company, as like our sort of fields operations officers throughout that entire experience. And then we finally got to a place where we decided to raise funds through WeFunder, which was quite the experience. You really have to set up entire business. You know, it's not something like Kickstarter where you can go and just raise funds and go and make something. You actually have to create an LLC, and you have to be able to file K-1s and all that stuff. And so it was a bit of a frantic, stressful thing. And then we decided to launch it in November of the year, which was probably the worst time to try to raise money at any point in time, because everybody's out getting presents for family and stuff like that. So I was like, all right, we're getting it done. And then we just kind of launched into making a film. And I had an amazing team, amazing group of people, of course. But we ended up finishing February 1st was our last day of filming. And then about 2 weeks later, I got a cutout to one of my producers, and we sat down in a room and we're like, oh, this is going to be great, you know. And she's like, yeah, you know, it needs work. It's a little long. And I was like, oh, you're right. And she's like, oh, well, you know, Matt will be back. Our other producer will be back soon. And Kristen, our other producer, will be back in town in a couple of weeks. And we'll have another screening and everything will be great. And then I think that was March 12th. I think it was March 15th when everything shut down in Los Angeles. So the film has really had like a very unique trajectory that any film that was sort of made during this time has faced, whether it's a short or a feature. But I'm just so grateful that we were able to make it, you know, because I mean, especially with like all the COVID protocols and restrictions and everything, I had many conversations with all of my producers where we were like, we don't know if we'd be able to have made this movie at the budget that we had it at if we had tried to make it during the pandemic.
And so what's the journey been like, making the film and then sharing with audiences? So it premiered at South by Southwest last year.
Yep, all virtual.
Yeah, virtual. And so what were your hopes for making the film and the experience of bringing your script to life and collaborating with the cast and crew that you assembled, and then how, you know, the story might resonate with audiences?
Yeah, you know, it was a really unique experience. I mean, having the opportunity, we shot basically the entire movie at night, which was another form of torture. And then everyone's like, you know, the three things that you don't work with are water, animals, and kids. And then I've done all three now, so I feel like I'm ready for anything. And, you know, the process of making a film was so wonderful. It really kind of offset everything that was like horrible in life during the pandemic, because it was just nice to have something to be working on during that time. I think the editing process in particular was really unique because in a different circumstance, Vanishing Angle would have been our home space where we would have had countless reviews. The company itself, run by Matt Miller and Natalie Metzger, is very interested in doing a lot of test screenings and really testing it with a variety of different audiences. Well, while we were making the film during the pandemic, we really didn't have a lot of those opportunities, especially for like immediate feedback. Because you'd ask people, okay, you could watch the film between like 7 to 9, and then at 9:15, we're going to talk about it. And you're still hoping that you could get that sort of immediate reaction. But then a lot of the onus sort of fell onto me being the editor and also the sound designer and of course the director and the co-writer and all that to find emotional space to be able to reflect on the film and see what worked and what didn't, which was quite the experience. And then I mean, really throughout the process, like throughout that review process, we talked to a lot of our collaborators, our DP and our creative consultants and our actors and got their feedback. And, you know, that's one of the most important things I think that you could do as a filmmaker is really create an open and creative process for everybody. You know, I mean, you are the captain of the ship, so to speak, being the director, but that doesn't mean that you have to say and know the final word on anything. So it was really just, I'm very much about collaboration and speaking to those groups. So, and that sort of extended also as well onto the set. I really wanted to create an open environment, and anybody that was from, you know, the executive producers all the way down to the PAs, if they had an idea that was better than the idea that we were doing on screen at that moment, I really highly encouraged them to speak up and speak to me or speak to our assistant director. Because in the end, like, you know, you're in it, your head's in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you always have the right answers. And I was just really, I mean, I think the thing that I hope people can come away with from the film is being able to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. I think that's one of the that's one of the greatest pieces of power of cinema, is our ability to really exist in a different headspace from our own, and hopefully not only gain insight into other people's lives, but gain insight into ourselves as well.
I love hearing you talk about the set culture, because I don't think that conversation happens enough.
Yes.
You know, there's this idea that the film is more important than anything else. It's more important than, you know, the lowly individuals working on it and, you know, whatever their role. And the director's this auteur and they're a god. And, you know, I really love hearing about these collaborative sets where, you know, everyone gets to have their input and feel a part of it and feel respected. And
yeah, I mean, I think that's so important, and there were so many instances. I mean, particularly in the final sequences of the film, where Lynn and Puya, our co-leads, really were asking a lot of really important questions and really challenging me on the notions, and really like asking for additional lines to be brought in and changes to the dialogue, and I accepted all of that because I felt like, you know, in the end, if they felt like they were being collaborated with, and they were going to bring the best that they could bring to the process. And films are made by people, they're not made by individuals. So anytime you're spending more than like $1,000 and you're hiring more than one person to work on the crew outside of yourself, like it's a collaboration. We should treat it as such.
And I promise you'll make better art if you involve more people and more people's perspectives and more people's expertise. And yes, yeah. So talk a bit about where the film goes from here. We're talking about this idea that, you know, you make the film and then you show it some festivals and then you have a theatrical, but you're not done. This film is going to live with you for a little while. What is that? What's the next phase?
It feels like a bit like my kid just went off to college. I'm not a parent, but I suppose it's sort of how it feels, where you're just sort of getting it out into the larger world. You're like, I hope people like you. I mean, I hope people like accept this. But you know, it is an ongoing process. You know, one of the things that really brought insight to that for me was I was talking to somebody and they said, like, what normally takes like a 4-year trajectory, that's not even the release of the movie, but or the release of the product, but like from the development all the way to, it's like 4 years to get to even like one product being made in most other industries. And in that time, you go and write it, you make it, you produce it, you distribute it, you send it out to film festivals, like you get distribution, like, and then you have to finally release the film. And it's just an ongoing process. It never really stops. And even as like I'm going on, hopefully with any luck, to my like later films, I'll still be talking about this one. You know, it never sort of ceases. That work never really ends. But then the important thing in that is to figure out a way to pace yourself, because it is very much a marathon and not a sprint. That I think a lot of like folks come out and they go and they make the thing and they're like, oh, it's just released. And I'm like, no, but you know, I'm still going to be promoting it a year from now and putting more stuff on social media and like talking about the behind the scenes process of the film now versus maybe just marketing it for festivals and distribution. And then of course the festival route in itself was really unique because I mean, during a virtual festival, I mean, you're just assuming people are watching it. You're like, I hope people are seeing it. And you don't know what their emotional reaction is. And as directors and filmmakers, we all crave, so you're like what Francois Truffaut said, you know, the most beautiful image you'll ever see is if you sit up in the front row and you look at the audience behind you and see all those faces looking up at the screen. You know, when you're virtual, you don't really have that experience. So it feels like this kind of netherverse of like, oh, I guess, I hope people watch it. But the really nice thing at South by that they did this last year was they set up like a chat room. So anybody that watched the film could go and talk. And one of the things that was really beautiful about that and beautiful about the process of screening it only virtually was that a lot of times when you come out of a film or you're going to a film festival, my producer, Matt Miller, always says it's sort of like a wedding. You know, you go to meet like thousands of people and then you're like, I don't remember half the people I just met or what the hell they just said. So it was a real opportunity for people to really sit down and say like, okay, like if I'm going to talk to this filmmaker, what do I really want to say to them, or the filmmakers plural. And so there's this wonderful opportunity where I was able to save all these chats that we had with these people that I'll probably never have the opportunity to speak to again. But I knew that the work had affected them at least enough for us to have a discussion about it, which is, I mean, there's few things that are greater than that.
So it's nice that there, I mean, I know some positives, of course, of showing virtually, but this is a great segue into the conversation that I'm most excited to have. And I'm glad that you and I connected around was the importance of seeing films in a cinema and in community. Mm-hmm. And I think that folks these days are accustomed to prioritizing seeing certain films on the big screen, mostly big budget, action, you know, with lots of special effects, you know, Marvel movies. But I'm often in the position as an exhibitor of making the case to see films like See You Then on a big screen for very different reasons. It's an opportunity to immerse yourself in a very dialogue and performance-driven film. You know, it's sort of this idea of intimate cinema, and it has the potential to share something that connects us as humans with different life experiences. You were sort of touching on it earlier. Roger Ebert calls it the sort of empathy machine of filmmaking. So how's it been releasing this film at a time where in-person cinema screenings are few and far between? I'll just start there and then I'll follow it up.
Oh my gosh, like it, you know, I mean, there was a point in time during the pandemic where I was like, is this even going to ever be seen in the theater? I mean, there was a real genuine feel. I'm sure we all felt that, where it was like, oh my God, it's this whole aspect of what, I mean, watching a movie at any point in time is a beautiful thing, but like being able to see it in the theater with a community, regardless of whether it's your own or somebody else's, there's something just effervescent and magical about it. And just, it just fills your heart, you know, like, especially if you're watching something that the whole audience is involved in, you hear the gasps and the screams and the laughter and the yelling and It's just, I mean, it's communal. It's so beautiful. Having the opportunity to do that. I mean, you know, like I said, I was so convinced that we weren't going to be able to do it that when it actually happened, it felt a little surreal, but really wonderful because there's something about just being completely distractionless in the theater that allows you to focus on things. And when I talked to people that had seen it in theaters, I could tell that they absorbed a lot more than the folks that I talked to who had seen it mostly virtually. Outside of like South by and a few of the other major festivals that, you know, people watch it online and then they like talk to you and like, oh yeah, it's cool, like whatever. But then when you talk to people like immediately after watching it, they're like, oh, but you brought this thing at the beginning and this is how you bookended that. And there's just so much a greater focus and attention. And honestly, it's like, if we all want to make movies and get movies out there into the world and have it on the big screen ourselves, we all have to contribute to that ecosystem. And one of the greatest things that I think came out of the death of MoviePass and that whole debacle was like AMC A-List and like the Alamo Drafthouse program. And it's like these things where it's like you're paying, you know, not to like shelf for exhibition, but like for these companies, but like, you know, you're paying like $30 a month to go see 3 movies a week max. And it's like, it's a bargain. And it's incredible. And it's like, yeah, the timing and everything's hard. Everything's so difficult right now. But like, it doesn't hurt to just go watch 1 or 2 movies a week, even if you have the opportunity, because it's not only about like contributing to that larger ecosystem, but also understanding what's out there and what people connect with and what they don't. And that is extremely integral to being able to have success, I think, as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I mean, you have to know how audiences are responding to films in the cinema and that's shifted a lot in the last 10 years as culture shifts.
Yeah.
And, you know, jokes that people could get away with, they can't get away with anymore, thankfully. And just like, it's amazing to me to see how a film I saw 10 years ago on the big screen, and then I see it again, you know, as a repertory screening, just doesn't play the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the greatest like aspects that we can contribute to sort of the greater text of what film and art can be, is like we're making things that exist within a certain point in time and they reference like what's happening in the world, even if it's a period piece or a sci-fi or fantasy, whatever, like they all pinpoint back to like what is important in that time, either for the filmmaker or also for larger pieces of culture. When we reflect on the history of the world, that's how we will be able to reflect, is through art and through stories and through how stories have changed and what people focus on. And what, you know, and that's the great fortune that I have as a trans filmmaker who's also Asian American. It's like I had the opportunity to make a movie. I mean, even when I was first growing up and I was in high school, I kind of considered it not possible because I hadn't seen a trans filmmaker out there, and I knew who I was and how I felt, but I was afraid. And there was a part of me that was like, oh gosh, like I can't transition because if I do, I might not have the opportunity to make a movie. But now we live in a culture where that is, you know, I mean, the pendulum swings back and forth, of course, in society, but like we're at a point now where that is becoming more accepted, thank God. But also, we're also going to see a torrent of brand new voices and new and interesting perspectives that we haven't had in cinema all these years, you know? I mean, while I was editing the movie, I made the very foolish and insane decision to watch every single Oscar-nominated and winning movie in history, which is like 436 films. And so it was great. It was great torture because like I watched from here to eternity, and I'm like, I'm a trash filmmaker. I make stupid things. Oh my God, what have I done? But then, you know, it's also like understanding that like that emotional trajectory of like, you know, there was like the 20s and 30s where there was a lot more exposure for queer folks and for openly gay characters on screen, maybe not overtly said, but like, you know, it's clear. And then, you know, we had the pendulum swing back, and then we have it coming back. And it's like, there's just a whole aspect of culture that you begin to understand as you unravel sort of the story of film.
And I'm going to go back a little bit to something you were touching on about this idea of going to the movie theater. And I appreciate that you're such a cinephile, but I know that a lot of young filmmakers, so I'm at Emerson College, and so I'm talking with a lot of folks who are sort of just, you know, starting to make films, and they have all these dreams that their films are going to show up on a big screen, and that there's going to be this audience magically there for their film that they aren't part of that audience for other people's film. And cinema, like right now, I don't know how many of you guys are regularly going to the theaters. I hope you are. But if you love it, you have to support it or it's not going to survive. Like, that's where we're at right now. People are, it was indie cinemas were doing well. But, audiences drastically fallen off and it hasn't recovered. And, if you want these things to survive, you have to actually support them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that, it's so cool, but it's just a hell of a lot of fun to go to the movies. And hey, if you go to AMC, you get to watch Nicole Kidman every like Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Give her a little spiel. But, we're facing a place, even in Los Angeles, like we're facing a situation where I go to the Academy Museum every week practically to go see another film, and we're only still at like 1/3 seating capacity for the whole theater. And I'm like, what's happening right now? Because if we're sitting here and we're getting like talks with like costume designers about Midnight Cowboy and no one's showing up, and it's bizarre. But I think there's also like, there's still a fear of COVID, of course, but then I think there's like we've fallen out of the patterns that we used to be a major part of our lives. And I think like cinema going is just something that became that thing, well, it's $14 or whatever. But even now we're testing like price variance in theaters and stuff like that. Like, going to the Academy Museum, it's like $8 with the membership and $14 without. Like it's worth it to go and have these experiences and really get to like seeing these things in the theaters and also gauging audience reactions, because that is so important. And the only way that we could gauge it is if more people go to the theaters. So it's it's the Ouroboros. It's like the snake eating itself. It just goes round and round.
And if money's a barrier, there are all sorts of ways to like volunteer at art house theaters, volunteer at film festivals, volunteer at film festivals. They need your help.
Yes.
And you learn a lot behind the scenes about how exhibition works.
Yeah, and that is like such an integral part of the process of filmmaking that a lot of film schools in particular doesn't teach, is like this need that we as independent filmmakers need to go through all these different processes and all these different steps. I mean, the amount that I've learned, even in the process of making the film, when it comes to hybridization between festivals and like independent distribution and getting in touch with theaters through those processes, or like Vanishing Angels, like attitude towards that sort of thing is if we say play at a theater in like Amsterdam, then they know the Amsterdam distributors and they say, okay, great, it's playing there. Why don't we coordinate a release so that when it's playing in theaters, then like 2 weeks later, it'll be out on DVD. And so all these things are things that we all have to consider while we're making a film, even before the script is finished. I think all the, even during that time when I was working on it, I was coming up with poster concept designs. Now, none of those things showed up in the actual movie. None of those things showed up in the publicity, but it was important for me to sort of flex that muscle and say, like, what is the marketability of this film? What are the challenges of its marketability? Because when we get down to the nitty gritty of actually trying to sell the thing and promote people to see it, I have to be aware of like its positives and negatives, its heights and its faults, because that way I can at least attempt to guide our distributors in a way that allows them to maximize the amount of profit that it can make and get the most amount of eyes that could be seen on it. And right now it's just an attention for eyes. There's so much out there right now between film and TV and digital media. I mean, it's very overwhelming. So to be able to be heard through that noise is something that we all as filmmakers have to learn to adapt to.
And I think it's kind of easy to, have your blinders on while you're making your piece and just focus on what you're making. But this idea of thinking about the whole life of the film and how it's going to reach audiences, because, unless you're just making it for fun with your friends, that's one thing. But if you're expecting it to reach an audience, then there's really no one better to do that work than you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that includes like doing stuff like one of the things I'm planning on doing with the film is recording a commentary and then releasing it so then people can play it at the same time as the film's being played, because I think that then it's a different way of sort of generating that additional excitement about the film, but it kind of ends up having to be endlessly promoted. But then you have to just be creative about the ways you promote it, because especially with social media, people get really burnt out if you're like posting the same photos or posting the same information. You have to keep it creative, and then you have to build all that stuff out.
And that also makes me think of something else we were sort of talking about, which is that's another opportunity for you to be part of the conversation with the audience.
Absolutely.
Because there's this idea that you put your film out there and, audiences are going to do with it what they're going to do with it. They're going to interact with it how they interact with it. And you can't dictate how an audience is going to respond to your film as much as you might want to, and as much as certain people with egos might want to do that. But every Q&A you have with your film, recording commentary, that's all an opportunity for you to keep that conversation going with your audience, it's a conversation you're having together.
Yeah. And it's not just about promoting yourself, it's about promoting the film, but also promoting the people that worked on the film.
Mhm.
I mean, I always say it, and I say it a million times over, and anytime I do this, like, the people that worked on this film, hire them, because they're incredible people. But also, like, I want their work to get out there. I want them to have more opportunities for Puya and Lynn and Jordan, my DP, and and all that. And so it's incumbent on me to try to promote it the best way I can, not only for myself, but for the people around me.
So do you want to watch that clip?
Sure.
Okay. So we have one clip. And I will just sort of set it up. I think it's an excellent example of the intimacy that we're talking about. As a viewer, you feel like you're at the table with these two characters with all this history that are doing this dance of reacquainting with each other after really painful rupture in their relationship, and sort of transformations for both of them. So for many, this is a world into a window outside their experience. And as an audience, you're invited into this intimate space and this intimate conversation. So I'm going to bring it up.
Hope it matches that lovely description. Ooh.
I set up everything for knowing that you guys would all get to look at this. I cleaned up my desktop. Okay, so here we go.
It's not like I could just waltz out of my apartment 100% woman the day after I decided to transition. This all took a lot of work, believe me.
I believe you.
You've had your whole life to figure out how to be a woman in society. I had like a year.
Okay. Yeah. What'd you learn?
How being a woman sucks in almost every aspect of society for all of time. No, it's been a really wonderful journey. I started watching makeup tutorials online. I went through a too much blush phase, a too much foundation phase where my head looked detached from the rest of my body. I had to figure out new shoe and dress sizes, which by the way, aren't even consistent in the same goddamn store. I know, it's so annoying. Hair products, how to flirt.
Oh, Chris. I'm sorry, you never knew how to flirt.
All right, so do you want to?
Sure. Well, actually, I was, as I was watching the clip again and thinking about it, that's actually a great example of collaboration in that I got very stubborn about that scene, and I was like, we're going to stick to the profile shots.
Mhm.
And then at one point, my DP, Jordan Perot, who's also my roommate in college and went to Emerson with me, was like, perhaps we should get some other angles. And I was like, what do you know about it, Jordan? And he was like, well, I'm the DP. And I was like, fair point. And I'm glad that I did, because my God, that scene would have been absolute torture if it had only been in the profiles and the wides. But it was that was during our second week, and it was kind of our punchy, kind of goofy week, because we had this crazy schedule. It was from we had to shoot at a bar, so we were available to film from 3 a.m. to 3 p.m., which is just a bizarre time to be awake at any point in time, but also particularly like when you're making a movie. But it was really fun watching sort of the chemistry of the crew sort of solidified during that week. I think, the one great thing about filming on set is just the idea of a shared experience with groups of people. And once you can see it, I think on set as a director, you start to see that synchronization happen between the cast members or the crew members, a fluidity that starts to occur. And that was like really exciting, sort of watching that chemistry and energy starting to happen.
Yeah, it's a lovely scene, and it's a perfect one to illustrate, what we're talking about this kind of cinema where you're in spaces where you wouldn't be able to necessarily be otherwise, and getting to sort of inhabit them with these characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the great, like I said, walking a mile in somebody else's shoes, like these conversation sort of films, I think have that opportunity to enlighten an audience, and also get them to ask questions about themselves. You know, I mean, I think that the great thing about cinema is that it could stretch across all boundaries. It could be documentary, it could be experimental, you could do Jean Dielman, or you could do Avengers Endgame, you know, and you could just have this giant span of storytelling and the ways in which we tell stories, but also like we can't get into a situation where we're only showing a certain type of film in theaters, for instance, or only highlighting a certain type of film on iTunes or Google Play or what have you. You know, I mean, there has to be a diversification of storytelling that even now I think is not really as far as we could take it.
So I want to invite you now into the conversation. I know a lot of you are filmmakers here, and I'm sure you have things to add and questions. And so just, I don't know if I can see people. Yeah, I can.
Yeah,
So raise your hand if you want to, if you have something that you want to add or question. Yes. It might help if you stand up, I think. I don't know, is there a microphone for the audience? Maybe not. Okay. Okay, go ahead.
You mentioned a little bit about working or fundraising via WeFunder.
Yes.
I don't know like where you're going with in terms of on the. I know part of that is like you're basically selling equity in the film. What was that like after you made the movie and that relationship with the the investors and the people involved?
Yeah, no, I think in a lot of ways it's relational to something like Kickstarter. Perhaps there's like a deeper connection because you are sort of more in touch with them in terms of finances, like sending out the K1s every year or making sure that they're like involved. We had a couple of executive producers come on the set. One of our co-producers came during prep and was like very integral in like helping sort of shape the narrative and the performances. So it was definitely like in terms of my experience between Kickstarter and WeFunder, I felt like it was a lot more collaborative with our investors. But it's also like, I think that everybody who signed up to invest in the film was aware of like the risks and the challenges of investing. So there hasn't been as much of like a business tete-a-tete back and forth, but more of just a collaborative, creative process. A lot of people that I think invest in Kickstarter and WeFunder and these types of crowdfunding or crowd financing initiatives, they just have a natural curiosity about film. They're film lovers. They love to talk about it. So, it's just as much fun because some of our investors have become very close friends of mine sort of throughout the process. And we text and chat back and forth, and it's not just about the film, it's also about movie recommendations, what have we seen lately, but also just personal relationship and friendship things about how their families are doing or how their loved ones, what jobs they're working on these days. I think the biggest difference between WeFunder and Kickstarter is just the amount of time that it takes right off the bat to get everything set up properly, because of course it is a business and you don't want to like do anything improper with that sort of thing. So it's been a really wonderful process. It's also exhausting, and definitely something if you're very like keenly interested in creating a film using that platform. I think it's really great. One of the biggest challenges I have with Kickstarter is and Seed and Spark. They're great platforms. They're wonderful, but when you're making a feature, it's very hard for me to just ask people to like give money to me and then to give them like an offering, like a t-shirt or a DVD or whatever. And I felt like if I was going to create a feature, that I really wanted to make sure that like the equity would be shared across all groups of people who would be investing in it, and not just like a bunch of people give me money and then hopefully I get to sell it and then I get all the profits. Because it just inherently in my head, it just kind of felt difficult for me to like rectify that. I think with shorts, and also I would extend that out to documentaries. I think that's definitely like a place where like Kickstarter and Seed and Spark could be great assets. But I think for me at least, when I was working on the feature, I was like, I just felt this desire, and it was a difficult choice because a lot, when you're setting up a LLC, I mean, it costs at least a minimum of $2,000 right off the bat in terms of all the filings that you have to make and making sure that everything's kept up to date. It is a challenge, but I think it's also more worthwhile in that way, at least for me.
Excellent. Other questions over there in the back?
I'm just curious about how did you promote WeFunder and how did you come across the investors? Did you invest the person or did you find the campaign online?
Yeah, so it was one of those things where you go and sit down and say like, who are the 100 like most well-off people that you know that who you can ask money for? So of course, a lot of the first investors were people that were friends and family. Just like as it operates on Kickstarter, you try to get it up to a certain echelon right off the bat, so you could really hit those like top metrics. People outside of it can see it. I think we were at, if my memory is serving me, a 50-50 split between people that were organic users, so people that like our friends and family, and then 50% of it was actually WeFunder investors. A lot of the WeFunder investors were people that probably talked more about the business aspects of it and asking questions about like how things are filed or like how the division of money comes in and all that stuff. And of course, you have a very elaborate long contract basically between your investors and the company itself. So a lot of those questions were sort of answered through that. But we had to keep relative engagement, I would say, throughout. The hardest thing, so we tried to raise money during November, and then of course that was a challenge, as I was saying before, but then we were like, okay, let's put a pause in fundraising and then let's reactivate it once we're in post-production, because we still had like a little bit of an extension of time from WeFunder. And then of course, like everything went to all high hell when COVID broke loose. And then I was like, wow, now we can't ask anyone for any money because this is like, we're all in a global crisis and nobody has a job right now. And this is horrifying. So I felt very uncomfortable asking for money at that point. So we asked them for an extension. They gave it to us. And then I was like, okay, June or July of 2020, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to raise that money. And George Floyd was murdered. And I was like, nope, does not feel like an appropriate time to be asking for money right now when all these other folks need it way more than we do. So then we waited another period of time, and then we finally got the final financing sort of in place in like August and September. So it kind of fell under like a different trajectory than I think a lot of the other WeFunder films and projects outside the pandemic, because I think they all kind of got a pandemic pass. But the other nice thing was, of course, working with Vanishing Angle. One of our big executive producers had executive produced the beta test directed by Jim Cummings. That was released last year. And so he was like a big get for us in terms of like sitting down and talking with him. And he's just one of the most lovely people that you'll ever meet in your life, and just a wonderful supporter of the arts. And he was totally game, and he came on set and like he did a little bit of extra doubling for some hands in certain scenes and stuff like that. But he's a good friend, and through that experience of raising the money, did we find those friendships. Very lucky.
Other questions? Yes, here in the middle.
Yeah, of course. So Puya, one of our co-leads, I saw her at a film festival at Holly Shorts back in 2016, and she really blew me away in this little short film that she was in. And I sort of knew it was her right off the bat, and we had started reaching out to like other trans talent that was like more like known, had been in shows and the like, and all of them passed. And I think there was also this feeling, particularly within the community, where it was like, oh gosh, we've been playing these roles where we're coming out, or we're having these difficult discussions about, transitioning, and we're just sort of tired of that sort of narrative. So they wanted to explore different things. But as the progress of trying to get the casting sort of went underway, there was like, I just kept on coming back to Puya. And then, we talk about this actress or that actress, and they're like, yeah, but it's gonna be Puya. I mean, like, we just send her the offer and stop fooling around like we're doing right now. And, oh, no. So we kept on like delaying, and eventually I was like, no, I'm just gonna put my foot down. It just has to be her. We sent her an offer. She thought it was a joke at first because she had never been like flat out offered a role before. But there's like a thing that I think certain actors have, and Puya has it, where you have their emotional conduits. When you see them on screen, like De Niro has that, where it's like you could just see all the thought process sort of happening in one's head as they're going, and it's true acting for me, where it's like you're really inhabiting that experience. And I saw that in Puya, and so when we sat down and we started talking about it, we actually got onto a Skype call. This is how long ago this was. It was on Skype. Zoom wasn't even a thing in mind's eye. And we sat down, and I was like very nervous because I was, like, it's like when you're going to the actor and you're like, I hope they like the thing. And so I was like, hi, I'm Mary Walker. Like, oh, and she's like, let me just stop you right there. Let me just give me a second. I was like, okay. And then she's like, let me just talk through what I see in the story. And I've never had that kind of artistic collaboration where somebody just laid out the themes of the story, the characters, the arcs, why the characters act the way that they do. And I knew then that I had somebody who was not only going to be an actor, but also a collaborator. And I knew that I needed that for something as intimate as this. Then we found through the casting process, and funny enough, the place where we auditioned her was a place that she had actually shot a scene for her feature that she had shot the year before, I Will Make You Mine, which is also available online. Y'all should see it because it's great. But that warmth that she came in with just a lot of warmth and friendliness, and I immediately felt at ease because I think that the auditioning process is just this horrid, awful process for actors, and to come in with such warmth and understanding and happiness, like really put me at ease immediately. And then she nailed the audition. But I also knew that through that process and knowing that she was a director, that she was going to come in with a slightly different perspective than just being an actor. She was going to come in as somebody who's gone through that and walked through that fire before. And funny enough, she told me later that she felt the same way when she came and auditioned, where she felt like, oh yeah, like Mari's just another Asian American, like filmmaker, like making her first movie, and that put herself at ease. And then while we were prepping for the film, we did a very extensive rehearsal process. But the rehearsal process wasn't really focused on going through the actual dialogue and reading through it. We only did that maybe about 2 or 3 times. But most of it was spent building out this relationship and this relationship between these 2 actors. A lot of it was actually them kind of going off by themselves and like coming up with an entire backstory for the characters, like their times in college, like what they fell in love with, when they fell in love with each other, like why. Priya came up with this idea that she would always, during that time pre-transition when she was dating Naomi in college, she would always play Rick Astley's like Never Gonna Give You Up or Never Gonna Let You Down, you know, that song. So then that became a running joke on set where anytime Priya felt like spirits needed to be lifted on set, she'd like start jamming to that music and just start dancing around, and it always did raise my spirits. But I think that a lot of that work really went into like creating that relationship because so much of the performances, you know, is this kind of hidden sort of undercurrent of all these other emotions that are kind of bubbling up underneath the surface because of this history. And a lot of the work that they did really went into that. And then when we were on set, it was just a lot of that comfortability, like that collaboration, that collaborative process. Like I really wanted them to own the characters, to rewrite the dialogue if they felt like it wasn't feeling right. But also it allowed me to like have this process where I could be really honest with them and say like, okay, can we do it this way? Can we do it a like slightly different take? One of the things that I think is really important from a directing perspective is just trying to keep like direction simple. You know, a lot of times like when things wouldn't work or I felt like things weren't working on set was when I was trying to deliver a note or on a line of dialogue that would like needed like a number of setups, like emotional setups for the character's arc and knowledge to get to that point. They already have that stuff working in the background. And then it's a matter of simplifying how you want to direct them to get to the right emotion. I think that's something I definitely learned in really working just so closely with just 2 actors pretty much through the entire movie. I mean, really, there's only 2 other characters that sort of pop in for about 5 minutes altogether.
Other questions? Oof, sorry. Yeah, over there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How long were you in the writing process, and what steps did you have to take to eventually get more concrete and feel like you were actually taking steps forward?
Yeah, definitely. I co-wrote the script with my friend from middle school, Kristen Uno, and she's a great writer in her own right. And it was definitely because it was a 2-hander. I felt like it was really important to sort of have somebody to bounce the dialogue off with. So I'd written a draft, and then I sent it to her. Well, I gave it to her. She was living with me at the time, and I was like, "What do you think? You know, I love your thoughts on it." And she's like, well, she was giving me the kid glove version of notes, which is like, well, I think like this part could leave a little bit more work, maybe like a little bit of dash of this. And I was like, yeah, cool, just, like do it. And she's like, what? And I was like, you're co-writing it with me. And she's like, well, I wasn't aware of that. And I'm like, well, you are now. So you're going to write it with me, whether you like it or not. And it was a really great process because I think it did allow for that collaborative thing. One of the things that she insisted on, which I was very angry about, but she was right in the end, was we would read the script back and forth to each other. And so for a time we would sort of write separately. I'd give her part of the sequence or part of the script and I'd work on a part of the script and et cetera, et cetera. And then we finally got to the place where we're reading it back and forth. Contrary to being here and like doing all this stuff, I hate the sound of my own voice, even though I talk so much. So it was really painful to like listen to the dialogue through someone as in like such a lack of expert in acting as I am. But finally, like we would read it through, and we go through, and then we'd map out the arcs and talk about like where this point is supposed to happen. And because it is a dialogue-driven script, we had to really be careful about like how to motivate some of the more difficult subjects to come to light. And so a lot of work went into that. And we felt like the script was right at a time when I was playing Chris and she was playing Naomi, and they have a scene of conflict. And I just started going off book and just kind of yelling at her as the character, but not like at her as like a person, but like her as the character of Naomi. And I was like, you did this, you fucking did this, you did that, blah, blah. Was yelling. And then I felt really bad afterwards because I was like, oh gosh, I just yelled at my dear friend for like 5 minutes, totally without any expectation. And then she said, I think it's ready to get that dialogue out there. And then I think a lot of it then at that point was then offering it out to Puya and Lynn and making sure that they felt comfortable with it. And the development of it was that thing where it's like, it as I'm sure many of us who are filmmakers in the audience have experienced, where it's like, it so doesn't feel tangible. And it almost never feels tangible until you're really in that final like stage of making the film where like, it's soft prep becomes actual prep and you're like maybe 2 weeks out from making it. I feel like until then, it never really feels real to me. But I think the hardest thing about it is just maintaining that motivation during that time, because it's so easy to just be like, yeah, that's not working out. Let's try it next year. Maybe next year will work. And it's really hard to find that motivation. But then it's the challenge of like having that motivation and that drive and that ambition, but then not letting that cloud yourself in the way when you're on set and not allowing for collaboration. So it's like trying to find that balance, because you have to be a little mad to be doing this stuff, because like it's almost impossible sometimes. And if it's impossible for us, it's impossible for like bigger filmmakers too. It's like one of the things that I always remind myself of is Spike Lee went to Kickstarter for 2 films before he won an Oscar for BlacKkKlansman. You know what I mean? Like one of our preeminent directors, like period, like had to resort to that to even get financing to make the next film. It's always going to be hard. But if you care about it and you love it and you feel like this is a story that has to be told, you'll find a way.
Here in the middle.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I think I did. I think part of writing this film, at least for me, was giving myself the dialogue to be okay with where I was in my life and where my life might end up being. I think that just being an individual, like I had a lot of expectations for what I hoped my life would be. Obviously transitioning sort of upended a lot of those expectations for myself. And I think that the script in a lot of ways was me trying to rectify those decisions and those choices and making sure that I was comfortable with them. And so I think like for me, like particularly for Chris, the trans character in the narrative played by Puya, she's obsessed with having kids. And that was something that was a really big part of my life. And I think as I was writing, this was coming at a time where I was starting to sort of reevaluate those feelings in myself and whether that really mattered as much as I thought it did, or was that a construct that I had sort of put into my own head. And I think having come out of the film the other side, I feel a deeper sense of peace about where I am than I had before. And I think that's probably what I gained. And then of course, there's also the other thing that's true about film. And I hate using this analogy because of a certain somebody that created the series that I'm not particularly fond of. She who shall not be named, funny enough. That films are like Horcruxes, and every time you make a film, there's a little piece of your soul that goes, choo, and then goes into the film if you really care about it, you really want to make it. And there's definitely like some moments in the film where I felt like my soul was like leaving my body as I was like kind of giving like this very personal piece of myself away in a very public way, which is always scary for anybody, you know. But also like refreshing to feel lighter at the end of it, I think. Yeah.
Over here.
I feel like right now we're in the spot with like a lot of trans representation in media where it's very cartoonish, like cartoonish trans photos and stuff coming out. And it's hard to get more nuance than that.
Yeah.
How do you get more nuance while still being entertaining?
I think it's just a lot of representation behind the scenes. I think that just goes a long way, and a long way into that communication and that discussion that we have on set. And I think one of the things that the entire team was really behind was making sure that our production designer said that filming of See You Then was there were the most queer people on set that he's ever experienced, being a gay man himself. And I felt like that was really important because you have to create that sense of safety and security on set, but there's also like, then there's different opinions. And then like Pooya comes in with her own perspectives on the experience and how the dimensionality of that could change the character. And I think it's a lot of like having that openness that I think with other, I don't know, non-marginalized narratives, I suppose, like I think that people just like sort of take it for granted, but we have to like create those spaces as creators and directors and producers. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have like a trans director making a trans narrative, but I think that you have to at least have a writer and you have to have a producer. You have to have voices of reason that can speak to those communities to make sure that they're being represented properly. And then I think a lot of it was just trying to like tell, but that's part of the challenge of financing the film, I think, was like, because it wasn't a coming out narrative, because it didn't fit within the rigors of what we assume queer narrative and particularly trans narrative cinema to be right now, it was stunted in that way where like, I think there was a lot of hesitation about like, oh, but can people sit down and watch two women talk for 75 minutes? And I'm like, God, I hope so. Like, come on, y'all. Like, but there's this expectation, I think, of like, oh, but it should be about a young woman who's transitioning, da 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 da. And I think there's also the challenge of, you know, for so long, I mean, God, like, I mean, since I was a kid up until really not that long ago, and certainly way further back before me, you know, there's demonization, the demonization narrative, right? And now I feel like the pendulum swung back to where it's like the deification narrative, where we're all saints and perfect people. And we just, you know, and I think that it's a positive move, you know, but I think that it's also like what the thing that Pooya talks a lot about is like, she just looks for narratives, if there's a trans character in it that she's to play, that they're just people, you know? And I think sometimes there's a great thing that comes with that sort of like ally representation, but at the same time, I think there also can come with this thing where it's like, I've met with other filmmakers and writers who are working on trans narratives and like, yeah, but they're perfect people. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm not perfect. My shoes are literally falling apart in front of you guys. I'm so sorry. I'm down on my shoes. It's really embarrassing. But you know, it's like that thing where it's like nobody's perfect. And the idea, the inherent aspect of drama is to find those quirks and those personality things. And sometimes if you get to a place where it's like the same narrative, it's the same type of story, it's the same thing, then it just becomes flat and boring and kind of inert. But I also see a lot of changes, like at Outfest, like last year and a couple of years before. Like I've seen an explosion of creativity and possibilities of changing those narratives and giving more dimensionality to it. But just like all things, I think unfortunately it just takes a hell of a lot of time to get the larger majority of companies and producers and what have you to get to that space where they can really understand the work that needs to be done to create these dimensional characters. Hopefully we did that. Hopefully we did that with the film. I hope so.
Well, I mean, that's how you make characters that people can relate to. If they're totally good or totally evil, somebody looks at them and it's a caricature either way. But when you've got a character like Chris that has some flaws and made some poor decisions and hurt someone, anybody can watch this and say, "Oh, that resonates with me."
Yeah, and to that point, like I do think that there are people that come out of the film that speak to that idea of like, oh, I remember when I made that mistake with that relationship that one time, and I'm like, oh, great, I'm glad that you're able to see past this like stopping point, which hits so many narratives and also audience members where they go like, oh, they're trans, or oh, they're Black, or oh, they're Asian, or oh, they're whatever. You know, and then they go, oh, well, I can't understand that experience because I'm not living it. I'm like, no, we can. You just have to open your mind up a little bit more, but also like we as filmmakers need to create a universality sometimes in stories that I think sometimes can go missing in all narratives. That becomes a challenge. And I think that is like the way that you can get to like the everything everywhere all at once, where you can get to a story that's like so wacky and crazy, but features an Asian American woman and a mostly Asian American cast and actually make money. And we're not hearing any of these discussions about people like protesting or being rude about it or any of that nonsense, thankfully. God. Also go out and see everything everywhere all at once.
And see it in the theater with people. I'm telling you, this is really important. Do not see this movie on your phone, on your laptop, even on your widescreen TV. See it with other people in the theater.
Epic.
It is epic.
Yeah.
So I just have sort of one question because we're getting towards the end to sort of wrap up. So as a filmmaker in a career phase, it's only a few paces ahead of some of the folks who are here. What can you share about moving from acclaimed shorts like Soul of a Tree and Swim only a few years ago to making your first feature, and sort of what's next?
Find your champions. Find people that will like go to the ends of the earth for you and for your stories. You'll find them if you care enough about the material that you're telling. And I've had several of those. Catherine McEwen was the one on Swim who championed the film. A friend of mine who I had edited for her and done some work for her in the past, and I gave her the script, and she really just felt like it had to be made. And having that collaborator with you during that time, I think, is really important because it is going through the vortex of life where you're like, oh God, is this movie even going to be made? To have somebody next to you that's like, no, it will be made. It will happen. Just believe in yourself. You know, that's important. And Matt Miller, of course, and Mia Schulman and Kristen Nuno for C then. Finding that champion, never giving up, and just constantly just like, even if you're just doing an experimental short or something like that, or you're writing a short essay or something like that, just keeping that creative mind going. Because there's so many spaces, I think, in all of our careers and in the past, the present, and the future, that you have to fill in those spaces. For instance, right now, I am currently in the process of editing a cooking show. Not exactly where I was like 1 year from now, I'm gonna be doing that. That's my dream. But you know, you have to make money and you have to be able to like keep the things going. And then hopefully some of that money that I make from that project will be able to be invested in another short or feature or anything like that. I follow the Ridley Scott way, which is try to attach yourselves to as many things as humanly possible, and hopefully one of them happens. And hopefully it's House of Gucci. I'm working on a couple of different adaptations. One of them is a trans young adult love story set in the 90s. And that could be pretty neat. But then also there's a project that was brought to me recently that's an adaptation set in Texas with two lesbians, and it's a great story. Hopefully things work out, and I may have the opportunity to write it and direct it. And then I'm working on a computer screen movie to sort of fill the time, because I feel like that's probably the easiest and craziest way to make a non-movie movie, by like having a bunch of people sit in front of their computers and act. And then I'm working on a documentary about the Japanese American internment camps during World War II, and that's been a long gestating project that several people who worked on it are getting really tired of me delaying on. So that's definitely very much on the horizon.
Well, there's one thing I want to add about finding champions. You find champions at all phases.
Yes. Oh, yeah,
Not
that's very
just
true.
before you
That's
make the
very
film,
true.
while you make the film, but also now. Those of you who are here, find out who on the festival liked your film, programmed your film, meet
True.
them, say hello to them.
Mm-hmm.
Like exhibitors can be fantastic champions.
Oh yeah, and that's so important. That's very true. And even like throughout the film festival process, we had Jeffrey Winter, who's our film festival programmer and director, and there are all these different people that come along the way. And I think like then the most important thing is at those times is treating those people with love and respect, caring about them, just being good people, being a good person. Is the most important thing. That is above all. It's above a shot. It's above a moment. It's above a sequence. Above everything else. Like being nice, talking to your crew, talking to them as people, not as just like people like, hey, what's up? Like, be like, okay, hey, like you're a filmmaker too. What are you working on these days? Like, what's your favorite hobby? Just asking them questions, and that will get them to a place where they will support you throughout all the difficult times.
Excellent. That's a fantastic place to leave off. So thank you so much, Mari, for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here and participating in the conversation. And for those of you who are watching this streamed either live or sometime in the future, thank you. And thank you to Nifty for bringing us here.
Yes, thank you.
See movies.